Good morning, everybody, and welcome again to the Global Lecture Hall, to our virtual Global Lecture Hall. Today, the day will be hosted by Shanghai University in China, from where we will have a basic talk by Rolf on the need on embodied cognition, and a guest lecture by Sheng Wang, who is actually from Shanghai Yaotong. Looking at the schedule of the lectures, we are in the second lecture, and after the introductory lecture on which was essentially thought to raise doubts on how you can characterize intelligence, today we will enter more into the topic, and we will and Rolf will argument in favor of something that most of us agree, that you cannot really study intelligence without considering that intelligence is a function of a body, of a dynamical system, if you want. So here we have a program of a day, which is in Central European time, where we still have daylight. So if you are here, you probably realize that. And we will have at 9:15 the talk from Rolf on the need for embodied intelligence. Then we will have a coffee break at 10 European time. At 10:15 we will have the guest lecture by Sheng Wang, which will talk about visual surveying in uncalibrated environments. So basically, visual surveying when you don't really know exactly the environment, which is the normal condition in the real world, but for a young toddler is actually a very simple task, right? So then we will have at 11 we will finish. And we will have a short wrap-up. So the first speaker of the day is Rolf, and so I pass the floor to Rolf. Rolf, your turn.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to see all the people from around the world in this 2014 edition of the Shanghai Lectures. So this presentation and the next one will be from Shanghai Jiaotong University, just for those who are not so, their memories are not so fresh about the geography. So last week we were in Osaka, Japan, which you can see over on the right, and today we're in Shanghai. And so Shanghai has a very spectacular skyline, and what I would like to do today is talk about cognition as computation, successes and failures, and the need for an embodied perspective on intelligence. Okay, now these are the topics from last week, and one of the topics that we were discussing is the IQ, the intelligence quotient, and it is well known that some people have a high IQ and some people don't have such a high IQ. There are many issues related to this, whether it's innate, whether it's in the genes, and if it's in the genes, then of course you can't do very much about it, right? However, if it's acquired, then you could do something about it. Right, now there's an interesting issue which has been discussed on the last line. Malcolm Gladwell, he writes popular science book, is also a staff writer on the New Yorker magazine. And he was interested in this question that I mentioned last time. Some people with a very high IQ, over 140, are professionally successful and others are not. Why is that? So the point is that it's not only a matter of the individual, otherwise all the ones with high IQ would really be professionally successful. Now, what Gladwell's point is the environment also has to be right. So it's not only the individual. If the environment doesn't cooperate, forget about it. Now here he gives a very interesting example on how the birth date can actually determine your career. So maybe if you're born in March, your career will be completely different than if you're born in November, for example. Now, if you take, for example, the Canadians are very good at hockey, ice hockey, right? And the junior hockey team of Canada is most of the time world champion. Now they have a selection procedure, and so when you look at the birth dates of the top players in the Canadian team, you will find that most of the top players are born between January and April. Now, why would that matter? Why is it that if you go 9 months back, that maybe it's in the summer, and then maybe the nutrition is not? I don't know. So the point is that the registration procedure goes by year. So if you're born in 1 year, you can be selected. Now, if someone is born in January, to take an extreme, and the other one in December, and these are kids when they're selected, they're maybe, 6 years old, then 1 year, so one guy's almost a year older than the other guy. And then maybe he is not more talented than the other guy, but just because he's a year older, he is better at playing hockey and is selected. And then he gets additional training and gets better and better where the other one has dropped out, even though the other one might actually have been better. So this is how the environment has to cooperate. So just being good is not sufficient. Now let's look at birth dates again. I think it's very telling. Do you know these people? Bill Gates, Bill Joy, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, Stephen Jobs, of course, everyone knows, and Eric Schmidt, CEO of Google. Now let's look at the birth dates. They're all professionally. They all have an extremely high IQ, over 140, and they're all professionally extremely successful. Can't hardly be more successful. Look at the birth dates. They're all 1954 or 1955. The oldest one seems to be Bill Gates, and the other ones are all very, very close together. Now, why is that important? Well, you can see that, and they have very similar careers, in a sense. And so it seems that there's a very narrow time window in which people with these talents, gifted people with these talents, when they started becoming economically active, that the environment, the economic and societal environment had to be exactly right. Had they been born, let's say, 2 years earlier or 2 years later, if they had been born 2 years later, they might not have studied computers, but something else, maybe life sciences. In addition, and this is very important, in addition, and this has been investigated in detail, at the time when they became economically active, they all had 10,000 hours of programming experience. Now, 10,000 is a magic number. So if you want to be an expert in a field, you need 10,000 hours of experience, of practice in that particular field. And this is a result by Anders Ericsson, a psychologist in the United States, and he studied that for many different fields. It holds for intellectual tasks like programming, it holds for sports like playing tennis, but it also holds for music like playing the piano. You can just take virtually anything. It's these 10,000 hours. Now, at the time, all of them had these 10,000 hours because previously they either had rich parents that could afford. At the time, it was not usual to have access to computers, but the parents could afford getting the equipment for their kids, or they had some teacher who had recognized their talent and gave them access to some university computer so that he could actually get the programming experience, which was unusual at the time. And at the time when they started their companies and their activities, They all had, first of all, the environment was right, and they had 10,000 years, 10,000 hours of experience. So it's this 10,000 hour rule, and the environment has to be exactly right. So just being clever is not sufficient. Right. Okay, that's the message. That's all I wanted to say about this. Now let's go to the new topics of this lecture. Okay. Now let's just a very, very little history. So 1956 is sometimes called the birth date of field of artificial intelligence. Now on the left you see two of the grandfathers of artificial intelligence, Herbert Simon and Alan Newell, and they had built in 1956, there was a conference where there were really three very, very important papers that were presented. One was by Newell and Simon, called The Logic Theorist. And this was the first program that could actually make proofs in propositional logic. It's also called sentence logic or propositional logic. It could come up with proofs in propositional logic. And Newell and Simon claimed, modest as they are, that for the first time in the history of mankind, they had created a thinking machine. So basically for them, doing proofs in propositional logic is a thinking machine. Now, every first-year student in computer science can write a recursive program that can also do that. So, whether you want to call that a thinking machine or not is, I guess, an open question. The second seminal paper that was presented at the conference was by George Miller, a psychologist, and he had written a very often cited paper, very, very famous paper called The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2. I don't know, has anyone heard about this? Probably the psychologists in Moscow know about this, right? So the idea was he was studying human short-term memory. Now, as we all know, human short-term memory has a limited capacity, right? We cannot keep just everything in short-term memory. And George Miller was asking the question, how can we measure the capacity of short-term memory? Now, in computer science, how do we measure the capacity, storage capacity of something? What's the measure? Maybe here in Shanghai, local answer. How do we measure? How much storage on a computer or on a disk? Bits and bytes, right? Now, he sort of found that the capacity of short-term memory varies largely if you're trying to measure it in bits and bytes. So, for example, take a phone number. Now, if you take a phone number in Germany, so there is the international access code, which in some countries is like 001, and then there is the country code, which for Germany is 49, and then if you're in Munich, the phone number in Munich, that's 89, and then you have the phone number. So what you do is basically you are chunking up what you are trying to remember into what Miller called chunks. And these chunks can vary in size, right? And then you don't need to remember just the bit string or the string of numbers, but you can remember these chunks. And that's why if you measure it in bits and bytes, there's a large variation. And he said we can remember roughly 7 chunks, plus or minus 2. So the capacity of short-term memory is not bits and bytes, but chunks. So I think that was a very important insight, which is well known to the psychologists, maybe a bit less known to computer scientists. Okay, and the third paper that was really very, very important was by Noam Chomsky from MIT, one of the very famous linguists, with his book, then one of the most cited papers in linguistics called Syntactic Structures, where he was arguing for a particular sort of way of grammars, transformational grammars. I don't want to go into the details, but it was also like in this framework of trying to come up with a computational model of language. And then we have John McCarthy, a computer scientist who was also part of this conference. So I think this was sort of the starting point of the field of artificial intelligence and has shaped the next 50 years in artificial intelligence. We will see that not everything that they proposed turned out to be the way they had expected. Along with this, I think it's important to understand the term functionalism. Functionalism and what's called the physical symbol systems hypothesis. So functionalism, functionalism was proposed, I mean, by the way, the term functionalism is used very differently in different disciplines. You know, it's used differently in neuroscience or biology or computer science. This more like philosophy, artificial intelligence, or cognitive science. So Hilary Putnam, American philosopher, he said let's say a symbol system has to be implemented in a physical system, but it doesn't matter what the physical substrate is. It can be, you know, electronic, as you see on the right. It can be spike trains in a biological brain, or he said, or it can be mechanical, as you see on the side there, or as he said, it could also be Swiss cheese. So you could basically implement an intelligent system in Swiss cheese. Now, what about the physical symbol systems hypothesis? It's very closely related to functionalism. And this is by Newell and Simon, the two people that we saw before. And they said a system capable of what they call general intelligent action has to have the capacity of symbol manipulation and has to be implemented on a physical substrate. That's why it's called physical symbol system. So you have the abstract symbol system that has to be implemented. And the implementation can be electronic. Most of the time it's electronic, or maybe it's biological in a biological brain. And they use the term general intelligent action because just doing one thing they wouldn't consider intelligent. Just playing chess or just doing addition wouldn't be intelligent, but being able to do many things. That's what they call general intelligent action, you know, drinking, manipulating, abstract problem solving. And this field that started in 1956, as pointed out by the American philosopher John Hogland, is also called GOFI. Does anyone know what GOFI means? GOFI. This is the term sort of used, or the acronym used for the field. It means good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, which already suggests that there's going to be something later on to actually replace this. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called good old-fashioned. Now, in classical artificial intelligence, which we will not talk about very much, these are the research areas. So abstract problem solving, knowledge representation and reasoning. You know, if you want to solve a problem, if you have a schedule, train schedule, and you're trying to find the shortest connection from, I don't know, Shanghai to some other city, Shenzhen or what have you, then you need a representation in the computer of the train system and of the distances, and then you need some way in which you can figure out which is the best route. Right. That's a typical example, acting logically. And then uncertain knowledge and reasoning is very important, because in the real world, as we know, everything is uncertain, right? Learning and memory, of course. And then he says that this is taken from Russell Norvig, communicating, perceiving, and acting. And interestingly, the only let's say, research area that relates to the real world, to the outside world, is the last one. All the others are just algorithmic. Okay, now this approach, the classical approach, has had many successes, many successes, actually changed society, but also many failures. And we will let's briefly look at the successes. You know, if you take search engines, you can take anyone, you know, Google, what have you. You can take chess. For example, we know that some of you, the older ones among you, may remember that we, you know, in 1997 in New York, there was IBM's computer Deep Blue was playing against the world champion at the time, Garry Kasparov, and won an entire tournament. And this was, of course, a landmark victory, so to speak, for the field of artificial intelligence. And I mean, now there are many computer programs that are as good as Deep Blue or even better, and they win against every human being on the planet, or 99.9999%. You know, there may be one or two people that can still play them, but so they're extremely good. Now, have we solved the problem of intelligence with a chess program? I mean, Herbert Simon and Alan Newell, about in 1956, about 40 years earlier, said that once we do have a computer program that can beat the world champion, then we have understood the problem of intelligence. Well, 1997, this was the case. We hadn't solved the problem of intelligence. We still haven't solved the problem of intelligence. Okay, so actually sometimes people say artificial intelligence is a field of false predictions. And I think there are many false predictions in artificial intelligence. But it's also a very exciting field. I think it's also fun to make false predictions. Okay, now let's look at these two successes and failures. Let's look at the successes. Another area is manufacturing. And I mean, if we didn't have this, let's say, the algorithmic approach, we wouldn't have all the things that we like. You know, like we wouldn't have cars, we wouldn't have mobile phones, we wouldn't have entertainment electronics and all these things. So, very successful. Has changed our society. Big data, you know, same thing. Algorithmic, a lot of machine learning algorithms in there. It's enormous what they can predict. You know, much better than human beings actually can. So very, very successful. Now let's compare the two worlds. So one, let's take as an example the industrial environment, and on the right, the real world environment. It is important to understand the differences between the two. Now, in the industrial environment, we have high predictability and programmability. That is, basically everything is known. You know, I can pre-program everything down to the last movement. And that's because, you know, in contrast, if you look at the real world, you know, where you have people who move around, take a university setting, take a downtown area, a soccer field, you know, what have you, there you have low predictability, high levels of uncertainty. You have to be able to react very quickly to environmental changes. Now, what's also interesting is that if you look on the left side, industrial robots, they are built typically from hard materials, you know, steel, hard plastics, electrical motors. If you look at human beings, you know, they're largely built of soft materials. 85% of human beings is soft, right? They're only, the skeletal system is only roughly 15% of the weight of human beings. So I guess the point is, if we ever want to understand all the abilities of human beings, you know, we can do so many things, we have to understand soft systems. That will be for later during the lectures when we talk about soft robotics. But this is just to anticipate. And also we can expect that we cannot take the methods from industrial robotics that work extremely well in the industrial settings and just transfer them to real world settings. But we need to think in completely different terms. Okay? Okay, back to the classical approach. Some of the problems of the classical approach. I mean, the classical approach has been very good at things like, you know, theorem proving, at chess, things like that. Actually, activities that are considered hard by human beings. The classical approach has not been very successful at replicating activities that are very easy, natural and effortless for human beings, like walking, talking, you know, cooking, manipulating the environment, and so on. Now, there's some fundamental issues with the classical approach. It's not only practical. So let's take, okay, I have a bottle here, okay, bottle of water. Now, why is perception hard? You know, in the classical approach, people thought, well, perception, that's easy. I just build a database of objects, and then I attach a camera to the system, and I match the camera image onto the objects in the database, and I have an object recognition system. And then they tried to do that, and it didn't work. Now, of course, with hindsight, we know it didn't work. Now, what's the problem? Take this bottle. Yeah, this bottle. Okay. If I hold it, try to assume my perspective. If I hold it like this, the image on my retina is completely different from when I hold it like this, or when I hold it like this, or when I hold it like this. There is virtually no similarity of these different views of one and the same object. But still, very easily we can say, yeah, it's a bottle, you know, in whichever way. Also, if the lighting conditions change, if it gets dark, it looks different again. For us, no problem. For computer programs, big problem. We will have a talk about vision later on, and maybe Hesheng, Professor Wang, can give us an idea of the problems that are involved in vision. Now, I talked about these virtual and real worlds before, and we can take as an example, this is actually a chess master. Monica, she was a master student in our laboratory 2 years ago. She was a chess master, and she was good at this formal game, chess. Now, in the real world, a real world game is like soccer. Now, what are some of the fundamental differences of the two worlds, real worlds and virtual worlds? I don't know whether someone wants to venture a few ideas. Okay, I guess one of the points is information acquisition in the real world always takes time. It can be very fast, but it takes time. You know, maybe it's microseconds, but it does take time. We always only have limited information available about the real world, right? I mean, we don't know what's going on in Los Angeles. We don't even know what's going on outside this lecture room here. I don't know what's going on inside your brains, right? So we have very, very little information about the world, but still we can function very easily. In the game of chess, we have complete information. There's only the board position. If I know the board position, that's it, period. Right? I mean, the real game of chess, not what the other one, not the strategy of the other one, but just the chess. We have complete information. This is impossible in the real world. Physical devices are always, however precise, they can be Swiss or Chinese, it doesn't matter, they are always subject to noise and malfunction. We have to take that into account. In the real world, there is no perfection. In the formal world, there can be perfection. Mathematicians, you know, they produce perfect systems, at least they think so. Also, there are no clearly defined states in the real world. I mean, how would I define your state? You know, of course I can make abstractions, and then I turn this into a formal system. But there's no clear state. How do you want to describe my state? Well, I'm standing, but I'm doing, you know, I'm standing like this, I can stand like this, I can stand like this. It's just standing, right? So, whereas in a game of chess, you have very clearly defined board position. It is either a board position or not. There's not something like a little bit this position or something. Whereas in the real world, you never have these very clear distinctions. And then, one of the things of systems functioning in the real world is also that they have to do several things simultaneously. You know, for example, you have to sit, you have to pay attention, you have to control your body posture, you have to listen, you have to breathe, you have to do many things simultaneously, which you don't have. A chess computer program only has to do one thing, right? Whereas in the real world it gets much more complicated. And then, in addition, the real world has its own dynamics. Things happen even if you don't do anything. If I stop talking here and sit down, then without me doing anything, you guys will start walking out the door here, right? That's just happening. I don't need to do anything. If in chess, none of the players makes a move, nothing happens. Right? So, and finally, the real world is highly non-linear and very, very hard to predict. So we have only very, very limited predictability. And this is what actually Herbert Simon called the principle of, let's see if this works, he called this bounded rationality. It's very hard to write on this tablet, rationality, because I don't get the direct visual feedback. It's called bounded rationality, and this is by Herbert Simon. Okay. So meaning that in the real world, any decision will be of bounded rationality because you only have very little information, right? So it cannot be completely rational. And I think that's important to understand and to take into account. I mean, this was a very quick thing on differences of real worlds and virtual worlds. You have the information in the slides. Okay. 3 fundamental problems with the real world. The symbol grounding problem, frame problem, and the homunculus problem. I will briefly mention, I don't think I have very much time left, huh? I will briefly mention the first 2, and the third you can just read in the slides. So the symbol grounding problem is the following. And I think people who work with vision, like Professor Wang, they know very well about this problem. So basically what you have is you have some abstract symbols, and then you have some sensory stimulation from the environment, and you want to map certain parts of this, aspects of this sensory stimulation onto these symbols. So you want to connect the abstract symbols with the real world. So when you say house, you want to be able to say, this is the house. Or, the tree, so we want to say this is a tree. Unfortunately, the real world does not come with labels. And this is Gary Larson, one of my favorite cartoonists. He did a lot on artificial intelligence and cognitive science, and here he is trying to solve the symbol grounding problem. Basically just putting labels on these objects. Of course, it's a joke, but I think it actually makes the point. You can think about this a little more, and it's a very, very hard, very fundamental problem that any system based on this classical symbol processing approach will have. It doesn't go away just like that. Okay, the second problem is this famous frame problem, and I'll give you a simplified version, but I think it's the main point. It's about maintaining a model of the real world. Okay, so if you look at this here, this diagram, you basically have a situation in the real world. You have a table, you have a block A and a block B. I mean, it's not a very exciting environment, but I think it makes the point. And then the hand moves block B onto the table, and this is then the final situation. You just table and you put this block over here. Not so exciting, but I think to theoretically okay. Now, if you look at representation, then you need to represent this situation somehow in the computer program, right? So that you can manipulate and solve problems. And this operation is called encode. So here you would have block A, block B, table, on BA, that means block B is on block A, and there are many ways in which you can do that. And then you have a move operator, and then this would be the final situation. You have a decode operation, and then this situation should decode into this real world situation. Okay, I mean, it's very simple, very straightforward. So this is also called the model relation. You have a model, and you have the real world, right? Now, it turns out, and this looks very, sort of simple and obvious, right? What's the problem? So where's the problem? If you start looking at that encode operation, you know how? I mean, this stuff doesn't come with labels, the real world. Now, how do you encode what you see into these symbolic representations? It's a very non-trivial sort of thing. It's, by the way, the problem of perception. And perception is being studied by hundreds of thousands of researchers in neuroscience, in psychology, in psychophysics, in artificial intelligence, in computer vision, like all over. It's a huge field. And it has been, remember this bottle, with the perception. It's a very, very, very non-trivial problem. So it looks very trivial when you just call it encode, and here you call it decode. You have something, and then you have to find in the real world, oh, what does this mean now in the real world, this symbol grounding thing. Okay, now, but what you do need is you need a model of the real world or a representation of the real world. Now, the more detailed your representation of the real world, the more effort you will have to put into maintaining the model, into updating the model that it corresponds to the real world. Now, you all know the situation. You're driving, and then there is a construction site. And there are always many construction sites. And that your navigation system tells you to go through there, but you can't because there is a construction site. That's because the model hasn't been updated, right? So you need to always maintain the model, and the bigger and the more detailed your model gets, the more effort you have to put into updating the model. Remember, information acquisition in the real world always takes time and effort, right? So you have to think carefully whether you want to make an extremely detailed model of the real world or whether it is sufficient to have a less detailed model. And in addition, most changes that happen in the real world are totally irrelevant for your model. I mean, the cars that are running around in downtown Shanghai now are totally irrelevant for what we're discussing here. So we can completely ignore. You don't need to represent that anywhere. But how do you distinguish between relevant and irrelevant changes in the real world? There is a very beautiful example by American philosopher Dennett. I'm not going to go through this. I don't have time, but please do read it. It's really fun stuff. So basically the problem is we have this robot that you can see there, and there is a cart. And on the cart, and the robot needs a battery for its power. It's on the cart. And next to it is a bomb, also on the cart. Now what the robot does, it knows that it has to get rid of the bomb. Now it says, okay, I just pull the cart out of the garage, and then the bomb is out of the garage, but it goes up and then the battery is gone. Because the cart and the battery and the bomb are bound together by the cart, by this real world condition. So you move the cart, you move both. And here, sort of what's happening in the real world is highly relevant. So it's a side effect of moving the cart. And in this case, it's very relevant. In most cases, it's completely irrelevant. If you leave the room, now after the lecture, the color of the room doesn't change. How do I know what changes and what doesn't change? Now, in a program like that, you have to really put that in there. I'm not going to go through this. Just read it. It's really a fun example. And the summary of Dennett is, what's obvious to humans is not obvious to robots. You have to program everything explicitly. There's a vast number of potential side effects which are mostly irrelevant. If you want to figure out whether a side effect is relevant or irrelevant, you have to test it. So basically, we have to test all the irrelevant side effects to see whether it's relevant or not, you know, which doesn't work. We don't do it that way. Okay. Okay, need for an embodied approach. I have, Fabio, how much time do I have left? Timekeeper?
A quarter of an hour, 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. Well, that's very good. Thank you. Okay. So basically, there are two views of intelligence. One, cognition as computation. Everyone knows what cognition means. So when I use the term cognition, it's like an umbrella term for mental activities, you know, like problem solving, memory, playing chess, language, and so on. Mental activities is called cognition. And here it's classical cognition as computation. That's the classical approach. You know, 1956, Herbert Simon, Noam Chomsky, and so on. And the more recent conceptualization of intelligence is embodied cognition as emergent from sensory motor and interaction processes. Okay, now what are sensory... Okay, we already looked at the first cognition as computation. Now, cognition as emergent from sensory motor and interaction processes. So there we have perception, manipulation, movement, locomotion, and so on. Now, let's see. Yeah. Now, you could say, well, if you want to use the classical approach to do these sorts of things, you have the problem of symbol grounding. Okay, now, let's look at the second one briefly. Cognition as emergent from sensory motor and interaction processes. Now, before we were talking about problem solving, abstract problem solving, doing mathematical proofs, playing chess, you know, things that seemingly happen up here. And now we're talking about movement and walking and things like that. What does walking have to do with thinking? Well, there is actually a very nice quote by Wolpert, a British biologist, and he asked the question, why do plants not have brains? I don't know whether you thought about this question. And then he said, well, the answer is actually quite simple. They don't have to move. So, of course, I mean, it's not quite true. Plants do move. You know, they move passively in the wind. They can slowly turn towards the sun and so on. So they do move, but they don't have that movement spectrum that we have as human beings. So in this view, the evolutionary selectionist pressure, and we will be talking a lot about evolution, the evolutionary selectionist pressure on the development of the brain, of the central nervous system, and of what we now call intelligence or thinking, has come from the need to move, to locomote, to move about, and to orient in space. Now, what's interesting about this perspective is that the brain has always been part of a complete organism. You know, it's not just an algorithm running somewhere in an algorithmic ether, but the brain is part of a physical organism. And the organism has to interact with the environment, has to survive in the environment, and has to reproduce in the environment. And then we immediately see the only way we can communicate with the environment is through our own body. Through our senses, we have perform actions that stimulates our senses, and in this way we can communicate with the environment. And it's the only way, so you can see that if we do not understand what the role of the body is in this process, we will never understand what we mean by intelligence. Okay, so I think that's a good argument of why we need embodiment. So it's failures of classical AI, the fundamental problems. Wolpert's quote, the interaction with the environment is always mediated by the body, and the brain or the neural system is always part of a complete organism. Okay, now last point that I would like to make today, and that's very fundamental. I have only fundamental, very deep fundamental stuff today. It's the frame of reference problem. And to illustrate, to give you a first quick illustration, I would like to show you a video not done. Can we have the Hyder and Simmel video? I won't say anything, just watch closely. I will ask you afterwards what you think about it. Yeah, there's a bit of noise that goes with it. Yeah. It was made 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Okay, thank you, Nathan. Okay, so maybe I can ask someone to comment on what we actually saw here. Would anyone venture a answer? What did we see here? Anyone? There are no right or wrong answers, but I can give you one. I give you one. There are circles and triangles moving around on a screen. Is that a very interesting one? Yeah. Okay, anyone? Storytellers. Okay, Osaka.
Okay, so hello, can you hear me, Pfeiffer, Professor Pfeiffer?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay, for me it seems like a persecution of, like the figures were like animals of some sort of living form. It was fun, by the way.
Okay, yes, and then we can of course add a story. You know, there are the little triangle and the circle. They like each other, and the other one is getting jealous and angry, and we can sort of make a complete story, even though it's just circles and triangles that are moving around. And this is one of the, I think, foundations. Here we have commented, one of the foundations of the frame of reference problem. And what David McFarlane from Oxford University, a famous biologist, he said, anthropomorphization, the incurable disease, which means that humans have a very strong tendency to project their own ideas, feelings, and goals into the environment. Now here we just have triangles and circles, but we can project a whole story and emotions and life and love story and I don't know what into this circle and triangle. And nothing's wrong with that. McFarlane said there must be an evolutionary advantage to doing that. But as a scientist, we always have to be careful. Are we talking about what's happening inside these circles and triangles, or alternatively inside an animal or another human being, or a robot for that matter, and what's happening inside our heads, our own heads? Very careful. So that's the frame of reference problem, just very quickly. Simon's ant on the beach, Herbert Simon, he says, well, let's look at an ant on the beach. So there is basically a food source somewhere, there is a nest. It picks up some food and then goes back to the nest. And it has a behavioral rule that says, go straight. If there is an object on an obstacle on the left, turn right. If there's an obstacle on the right, turn left. Otherwise, go straight. And then the path of the ant will look roughly like this. Now, the path of the ant looks very complex, right? If you want to memorize that, you would have to use very complex. But the behavioral rule is extremely simple. You know, what's encoded in the brain, the behavioral rule, go straight. If there's an obstacle on the left, turn right. If there's an obstacle on the right, turn left. You know, otherwise go straight. That's it. But you get an extremely complex trajectory, so you see that the complexity is in the interaction. It's not inside the brain of the ant. I think that would be a fundamental mistake to assume. Now let's make a thought experiment. Let's increase the body of the ant by a factor of 1,000. You know, let's turn this 1 centimeter thing into a big thing like that. Okay? But we leave everything else the same. We leave the environment the same. We leave the behavioral rule the same. What would actually change? What would be the new path? Just a giant ant, everything else the same. What would be the new path of the ant? Just a quick answer, yes? It will go straight, right? It will be very much, let's see if I can actually do this. I can't draw this now. Not really straight, but much straighter than before, right? So, and mind you, we only changed what we now call the embodiment. We only changed the size of the body, but we left everything else as is. And we get a completely different behavior. That's something to keep in mind. So if you only look at the behavioral rule, and if you only look at the environment, you can't say what's happening. You need to know what the embodiment is like. So we have 3 issues. The perspectives issue, I mentioned that. Are we talking about the agent? The perspective of the agent, there we would have the simple behavioral rule. Are we talking about the external observer, we as the scientists, who see the complex trajectory? So the complex behavior, simple mechanism, and we have a complexity issue, the fact that even if a behavior looks very complex, it may be the result of a very simple internal mechanism. The other way around is also possible. If you see a complex behavior, if you see a simple behavior, the mechanism may actually be very complex. But here, it's the complex behavior, simple rules. And now I don't know whether Fabio actually wants to maintain this competition. We used to have a competition. The frame of reference.
Well, Rolf, we may change the prize. We may change the prize. Something like task and 2 cookies. I don't know, Cantucci, you know, the cookies? Something like
Cantucci,
that.
Italian cookies. Okay. He wants Italian cookies. Okay. Okay. No problem. But anyhow, the message is this problem is so fundamental. I mean, you may think it's trivial. If you go to the literature in psychology, in artificial intelligence, in cognitive science, it's full of confusions about the frame of reference problem. Even Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, confused the frame of reference problem. So it's a very fundamental problem, seems trivial, and it's so important. If you forget everything that we do during this lecture, but one thing you should remember, it's the frame of reference problem. That's why we had this competition. Should the lecturer, any of the lecturers, not mention the frame of reference problem in one of the lectures, and you are the first to discover that he didn't mention it, you get either, well, Italian Cantucci cookies, Swiss chocolate, or champagne. Okay, well, that's it for today. Thank you very much. Okay, back to Fabio.
Okay. Thank you, Rolf. We may have time for one quick question. So, no question. We can meet again at 10:15 for the guest lecture by Professor Eshen Wang.
Is that okay, or should we finish at...
It's okay.
Is okay?
I'll be leave the box.
Okay. Okay, good.
Okay. Okay,
So
thank
we
you,
set
Rolf,
up,
again. I have many questions, but in favor of time, I will keep for another occasion.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
And see you next week, same time, same virtual place. Thank you all. Thank you for attending, and bye-bye.